Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com. Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
Welcome, everyone, to the Community IT Innovators webinar on SharePoint for nonprofits. If you have questions about file sharing and collaboration at your nonprofit, if you use Microsoft 365 online or you use Teams to collaborate with your colleagues, you probably use SharePoint. Have you been confused about SharePoint in the past? Sometimes SharePoint training is overwhelming. It can be overbuilt, the SharePoint itself, or complicated. So in this webinar, we're very excited to have two experts who can answer some of the most common questions and walk you through ways SharePoint makes sharing files easier. So just a note, that is in fact one of the first points, is that SharePoint does an awful lot, and we don't have time for everything in this hour, so we're going to be talking about it as a file sharer. So our learning objections for this session are that after the session, you'll be able to learn what SharePoint is and how it is used for file sharing, know more about choosing SharePoint as a file storage or sharing solution, and understand concepts about creating file sharing architecture for your nonprofit. I want to remind everyone that Community IT is vendor agnostic, and this presentation is to discuss how nonprofits are using common tools and what we're observing about them, but we aren't making recommendations on any platform in general. We only make recommendations to our clients based on specific business needs and nonprofit culture. So now I would like to let Steve introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Steve Longenecker. I'm the Director of IT Consulting at Community IT. I've been at Community IT for 18 years. I just got the congratulations email yesterday, actually, from our CEO, Johan. So that's quite a milestone. I mark it by the fact that my son, who was in college, was born about a month before I started at Community IT. So I'm pleased to be with you. I've been doing a lot of SharePoint work at Community IT for quite a few years now, and I'm, I guess, considered the practice expert of SharePoint at Community IT, although I'm also sending a lot of work to some of our other technicians because there's a lot of work to do. So it's great to be with you today.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And my name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the Marketing and Outreach Director at Community IT. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited about this topic. If you're not familiar with Community IT, a little bit about us. We are a 100% employee-owned managed services provider. So we provide outsourced IT support. We work exclusively with nonprofit organizations, and our mission is to help nonprofits accomplish their missions through the effective use of technology. We serve nonprofits across the United States, and we've been doing this for over 20 years. We are technology experts, and we are consistently given the MSP 501 recognition for being a top MSP, which is an honor we received again in 2022. So now I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker from Build Consulting, Kyle Haines. Kyle?
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, Steve, for having me today. And I'm really excited to talk more about SharePoint today. I imagine that I'm going to learn a lot from Steve. And I actually, in thinking about this webinar, remembered that Steve and I worked on a SharePoint implementation together nearly 7 years ago. And I think our understanding of SharePoint has evolved and grown. And I think SharePoint has evolved and grown as well. So I'm just incredibly grateful to be here today and excited to answer questions and to have a great conversation. I can just share a little bit more about Build. We are very similar in many respects to the work that Community IT does, in that we also help organizations that are trying to tackle complex technology questions and figure out how to use technology better to advance their mission. And we, like Community IT, we're passionately independent. So you'll probably hear that a lot today in my commentary, that SharePoint is one solution. We don't always think it's the only solution. And I heard you say a version of that as well, Steve. We focus predominantly on assessments, selections, and helping with implementations. So it's germane to today's webinar because oftentimes we're asked, we have SharePoint, we're not sure we're using it right. Or we've heard a lot about SharePoint, is that the right solution? And we are working to help answer that question, and hopefully today's content enriches your understanding of that and what we've learned through the years. And then next, we oftentimes help organizations select a solution like SharePoint. So just want to share a little bit more about Build. And Carolyn, thank you again for bringing us together today, and I'm really excited for the conversation.
Great to have you, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. All right, so we're putting up the agenda. These are a bunch of questions that we received at the registration, and some more that we hear quite often from clients and prospective clients, and among our networks as well. So this looks like a lot. We're going to try to get to everything, but yeah, it's a lot to take in. There's a lot about SharePoint just as a file sharer. So, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us after this webinar. All right. So to begin with, we have a poll. Here we go. So are you using SharePoint now? We wanted to get a little gauge for who is in the webinar today, our attendees. So I'll give you a couple of moments to answer. The first option is yes, and I have questions. The second answer is yes, my organization has a hybrid system, part SharePoint, part something else. So you're using SharePoint, and maybe you have some other places that files are shared, or you're considering putting together a hybrid system and have some questions about that. We have the option no, but we're thinking about it. And then the fourth option is not available. Steve, can you see that? Do you want to read the result?
I can see that. Yes. Great. All right. So yes, I have questions, or the first choice was roughly half, 46% of the respondents said, yes, I have questions. 42% were doing it hybrid with SharePoint already. They may have questions too, I suppose. No, we are thinking about it is about 10%, and not applicable. We had one respondent say not applicable.
Okay.
This, just really quickly, just as a reflection on that poll, I mean, it's interesting. Most of our work, I think most people answer when they're engaging with us, question 2. They have a little bit of SharePoint, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So it's interesting to see the percentage of people on today's webinar that find themselves in that same situation.
I think we're going to start out with a few kind of fundamentals and basic questions around SharePoint, including if you're brand new to Office 365 and you need help, how SharePoint works. We're going to give you a quick overview. And then we're going to talk a little bit about who should own SharePoint at an organization, how you would choose it, and if you did a project moving to SharePoint, how long does that sort of thing take? What does it cost? Those types of questions. So I want to start with this first one, and I think, Steve, that's the next slide, is how does SharePoint work? An easy one.
So how does SharePoint work? I'll take a stab at this first, and Pal, you can fill in all the gaps I'm sure I'm going to leave here. So SharePoint works like a lot of cloud file sharing storage systems. Competitors would be Google Drive for people who are in the Google platform. Box is a really strong sort of platform that's not necessarily tied to other services as much. And Dropbox is a product that we see some of our nonprofit clients using, and that we've recommended to some of our nonprofit clients in the past, for sure. It sort of comes out of a consumer space, but they have a business version as well. So all of these systems share a couple features. The actual files are not on a server in your server room or in your server closet, the way it used to be in the olden days. That represents right there a huge step up. Instead of being on a single box that you buy and pay for and try to maintain as best you can. And if it fails, you lose all your files. I mean, you probably have a backup, but that's still a big hassle. It's on a service provider's server farm somewhere, and they are responsible for lots of redundancy and lots of and uptime to a certain agreed upon level, a service level agreement. And you don't have to worry about any of that. In this case, the service provider is Microsoft. It's part of the whole Microsoft 365 bundle of services. So a lot of our clients started out with Microsoft 365 for email services. It used to be that you'd put your email on a server as well. That was a long time ago. That's really not a good idea anymore. It's much better to have your email services provided by a service provider. The two big players are Google and Microsoft. But if your email is in Microsoft, it's like not that much harder to start putting your files in Microsoft and to use SharePoint for it.
Steve, I don't want to interrupt, but I wonder if you might put up that other slide just for a moment, because I think that had kind of the different connections that the different Microsoft, different applications have to. There you go. So it is like a web. It's a lot of things. Thank you, that are all connected together when you're using
Microsoft 365. So some of the reasons that we love recommending SharePoint to our clients is that it is part of that Microsoft 365 stack. And so all that integration sort of comes to you out of the box. You don't have to build any of it yourself. And that means that you get Microsoft 365 security features. Your users are probably already used to logging into Microsoft 365 to get email services. So the fact that it's all sort of in one place makes things really powerful. One or two more things about how does it work in general. The files are in the cloud, so you can access them through a browser, certainly. And that was sort of the method that was most common in the olden days. It still is a great way to access the files, especially since it used to be that connecting to something through a web browser was really slow and tedious. But now, all of us have such ubiquitous and strong bandwidth that it's not that slow to do it that way. But you can also sync them to your own computer, and you can access them through File Explorer if you have a Windows computer, or through Finder if you have a Mac computer, and double click on a file, open it, edit it, knowing that in the background, it's going to sync up to the cloud when you're done with the editing, or even while you're editing live and in process.
I mean, I think that, what I might add, and I think that this is probably emblematic of the approach that Build takes, is that understanding how SharePoint works is a challenge for many organizations as they're considering these decisions. And the slide that Carolyn referenced and the information that Steve gave, it's really important that people who are involved in making these selections understand at a high level, what is it that we're talking about? And so I always think that organizations that are asking this question are asking the perfect question. What is it that we're talking about? And even though we're not talking about something like a CRM platform, like something similar to Salesforce or Microsoft, when we're involved in beginning to have conversations about what the right tool is, creating an educational foundation so people know what it is that we're talking about is incredibly important. So I love this diagram, Carolyn. I think it's great. And I think that there's probably a number of other resources that you can get from Microsoft or from other vendors that really help people who need to be invested in the decision, the people who are going to be ultimately charged with advocating for the decision and championing the decision, getting them to understand early on what is this thing that we're talking about is incredibly important.
That's a great segue into, I think, the next part that you were going to talk about, Kyle, and ask you about is maybe who owns SharePoint and how one goes about making that choice. But we have a couple of questions that I want to get to from the Q&A. Someone was asking about SharePoint versus OneDrive, which I know we're going to talk about a couple of slides from now. So don't worry, we're going to get to that. And also a question from Jennifer Keller-Jackson about nonprofits starting to use SharePoint when corporate America has been using it for some time. Are there other tools out there on the horizon, or do we feel like SharePoint is, one of the tools going forward, at least for a while?
I don't think SharePoint's going anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, but it is notable that Microsoft is sort of burying the original SharePoint user interface more and more in their myriad other user interfaces. So that's user interface is kind of a techno babble speak, I admit, but it used to be that the only way to access the files that were stored in SharePoint was with a browser, period, full stop. And you went to a SharePoint site that was owned by, it used to be that it was owned by your company and your organization and hosted on a server, probably at your, a SharePoint server. Now, you go to something.sharepoint.com and it's on a Microsoft server in a data center somewhere, but it's part of your Microsoft 365 tenant, but you would still go there in a browser. But then you could also sync those files so that you're accessing them through File Explorer, through Finder. We talked about that briefly. But it's also important to note that Microsoft's sort of design principles are to give 18 ways to do the same thing to their customers. It's kind of a spaghetti on the wall, what sticks kind of approach. And no one liked SharePoint. I think it's gotten so much better that in some ways, just when it was finally sort of getting over all of the user interface problems that it had at one time, and I'm sure some people in the longtime developers at Microsoft who were big champions of SharePoint felt this way too. Like, we finally solved all these problems and now you've given up and you're asking your customers to do things other ways. So now we're going to talk about OneDrive in a little while, but you can access SharePoint libraries through OneDrive. And so your users who don't really understand the technical details don't realize that they are potentially going to a SharePoint library because they're going to it through the OneDrive interface. Similarly, Microsoft's making a huge push on Microsoft Teams, right? It's kind of supposed to be the new, used to be that everyone started the day in Outlook and ended the day in Outlook. And Outlook was where my contacts were, my email was, my tasks were, everything was in Outlook. And it was so useful because it was all in one place and all integrated. Well, Microsoft wants to recreate that experience in this decade with Teams. Start your day in Teams, end your day in Teams. All your files are in Teams. All your collaborations with your colleagues on the various teams that you're part of are in Teams. Your project management's in Teams. Everything's in Teams. Well, you can access SharePoint libraries through Teams. And in fact, they're trying to make it almost transparent so that you could spend a fair amount of time in the Microsoft stack using Microsoft SharePoint all day long and never really realize you're using SharePoint. So that does make it the answer to Jennifer's question somewhat complicated. SharePoint's, I think, here to stay, but whether or not it's sort of surfaced as SharePoint for end users, I think that's a question that I have less certainty about. But I don't think that means, we're putting our organization at risk by investing in SharePoint right now, because I think even if you invest in SharePoint, that investment will hold and be useful into the future. It's just that you may find that your users are accessing those files through other means because Microsoft gives you so many different ways to do that. What do you think, Kyle? Did I answer that all right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, maybe I would talk to it from a market perspective. I don't think, I think it's unlikely there will be new entrants into the space. I think Google and Microsoft are obviously two of the bigger players. There's some other typically consumer and some corporate applications like Box and Dropbox. I don't think they're going anywhere either. But I think in general, I would be leery in this area of looking at a new entrant into the space to handle such a vital business function. So I would definitely be looking to one of the more stalwart organizations like Google or Microsoft or Box or Dropbox, and there may be others. Those are what come to mind. And I agree with the sentiment. I don't think Microsoft is going anywhere. And I think that for those of us who are old enough to remember when Microsoft meant the operating system on your laptop, and it means something much different now. It's clear that they're very interested in owning this space. And so I think that they're going to continue to make investments in the product. And Steve, you mentioned some of those investments they've made recently.
Yeah, that's a key element. I mean, what you don't want is to have your the service provider for a service as vital as this sort of resting on their product and not continuing to make investments. So it's really helpful that Microsoft is very motivated as a services company first and foremost, that needs to please their customers to keep them, and it's very helpful for all of us that there is a competitive landscape, and there are at least 4 big players in it. I'd say Dropbox is a distant fourth, but Box and Google and Microsoft are all pushing, and so they're pushing each other to continue to improve their. Each of them are improving their products. All of these products are improving every year. Strikingly so, I would say.
No, totally. I'm seeing a couple of the questions coming in chat with kind of some specific questions about sites. So I just want to remind everyone, we're talking about the file sharing today, but I'm seeing enough questions that maybe we can come back and do a separate webinar on sites and how both how to set those up, if that's what the route that you're going to take, but also if you have that as a legacy management, that some people seem to have some questions about continuing that or shifting to this different paradigm where you're using Teams to get the documents or whatever you're using. But I want to make sure that we get Kyle to give us a little bit about who owns SharePoint. And Kyle, if you were putting together like your dream team at a nonprofit of the committee that would make this decision and, take ownership of it, how would that work?
Yeah, and I was really hoping Steve would take this question. I'm bummed that I had to take it. I think that it's going to be, you asked, I love the framing that you just gave me. So let me talk about a dream team. So I think that for many organizations, content, including internal content, is incredibly important. And so my dream team would be somebody who could span the organization and serve the needs of both the entire organization and individual departments in helping to manage, store, and categorize the information that we sort of think of as files. And I think, as I said at the outset, this looks different for different organizations. That said, I think that a well-done implementation of SharePoint, and part and parcel with that is Teams and OneDrive. IT is an important stakeholder. And Steve can talk about this probably in greater detail or even challenge this assertion in its entirety. The role of something like Active Directory becomes much more important when you implement SharePoint well, in my view. And for many organizations that I've worked with, Active Directory has been something that has been minimally invested in. It's structured in an ad hoc way or incrementally. And so if an organization was new to SharePoint, I would want to understand, how is Active Directory being used currently? How much thought has been given to how groups and teams are organized and their permissions have been organized around those principles? So I see that owning SharePoint as being something in my dream team as a very tight collaboration between a function outside of IT that's thinking about content in strong partnership with IT.
I agree with that. The one thing just for our listeners who may be blanching at Active Directory. So we're probably, since we're talking about Microsoft 365, we're talking about the Azure Active Directory. So it is this sort of the same thing, but you don't need like Active Directory, the server version. Like you may not have it, and that would be fine. Like but I think the larger point is that the way Microsoft organizes things is generally when you spin up a site to host a document repository, which in Microsoft parlance is a library, the people who have access to the documents that are in that library are the members of the site, and the members of the site are indicated as members by their in Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, to be clear about it. So if I spin up a finance site, automatically there is a finance Microsoft 365 group that gets created, and the members of that group have access to the resources in the finance site, which includes at least one, usually, SharePoint library for the documents. And I agree that there therefore needs to be someone who understands who should be in that finance group and who should not be in that finance group. And there needs to be an understanding that it's important for the long-term health of sort of governance of documents that you don't immediately have exceptions start. So you cannot have like a subfolder buried deep down in that library that you want to tell your IT department, oh, except for this folder only the CFO and the CEO can have access to. The rest of the folders, the finance team can have access to, but not those. No. We do not want to start down that road right off the bat. It's going to work much better if you're thinking about it in terms of governance, that we're going to give this whole thing to the site, and we're going to administer permissions with that group membership, which is what Kyle's talking about, the Azure Active Directory. That does not mean actually SharePoint has a great deal of latitude, and we encourage our clients to use it to give extra permissions to individual files, and the users can do that by doing what's called sharing. So a member of the finance team might share a specific folder with a program manager. That specific folder has the finance documents for that program. The program director can see those documents. They can't see the rest of the finance folder. And then we can run reports as the IT department. We can run reports periodically that says, these are the shares that are sort of the ad hoc shares that have been added. And we can run those by the people in charge of governance to make sure that nothing looks untoward or inappropriate. We can even set up alerts that if certain files or folders are shared, someone gets alerted that sharing happened, so that if, again, somebody's sharing something incorrectly, that can be addressed. I do think there's a role for it. The other role for IT is sort of to slow the sprawl. Microsoft has sort of taken a page out of the whole sort of consumerization of IT, of allowing a lot of latitude to end users to create SharePoint sites when they want to create teams when they want to. And that's great, because a lot of times in the past, IT departments have been a roadblock to moving quickly and getting things done, because you need to put in a ticket and it might take 5 days. And in the meantime, you're losing time. You want to just get this done yourself. And it's not like it's that hard. Microsoft has made these things very easy to do. And so that's sort of one extreme governance style, which is to say, just let 1,000 flowers bloom. We'll figure it out later. And it can be done. Steve, at Community IT, we sort of done that. And I know that at the end of the year, sometimes it's like, what are all these SharePoint sites? What's in them? Who owns them? And is there anything in them? Should we delete them? And it's like, there's like a whole, so if you instead want to like have IT put some sort of slow bumps, like, hey, let's if we're going to create a new team, let's have a process for doing that. You can still do it, but we'd like you to like indicate that it's done. Yeah.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed. Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.